Welcome to 360 Money Matters, where financial planners Billy and Andrew talk all things financial planning. This podcast aims to increase your knowledge and confidence with all things money. Each week, they will cover topics like wealth creation strategies, investment principles, creating passive income, paying off your debt faster, and much, much more, so you can live a life on your terms without limits.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of the 360 Money Matters podcast. I'm Billy and I'm joined by my co-host,
Andrew. Bills, here we are back again and back on for another 360 Money Matters podcast.
This is true, Andrew. We are too, and I'm trying to think of something creative to say to talk about your jumper, because it feels like we're commentating at the cricket.
We are. I thought that's exactly what we were doing here. I thought we were sponsored by Cricket Australia. Shameless plug.
So for those that are listening to the podcast and can't see the video,
Billy's been hanging it on me all day.
Andrew's wearing a cricket jumper.
It's not a cricket jumper. It's a Tommy Hilfiger jumper. It just, you're associating it with a cricket jumper.
It's a cricket jumper.
It does look a little bit like a cricket jumper. It's kind of ruined the jumper now that Billy said it.
Have you ever played cricket in your life?
I've never played cricket in my life.
All right, so Andrew, let's get back on track. What are we talking to everybody about today?
So today we're talking all about asset protection. So we talk a lot on this podcast and to all of our clients about building wealth and generating wealth. But I think sometimes maybe one of the forgotten sort of side topics until you hit a certain level, and it sometimes almost is too late, is asset protection. So how do you protect your assets? How do you do it early so that when you are building your assets, you're doing it in a manner where if something does go wrong, and obviously that's not what you expect, but if something does go wrong, how you actually protect those assets. So yeah, that's the topic today.
Yeah, and look, I think it's a really good one because we spend a lot of time talking about wealth creation, and we usually touch on from a asset protection perspective. It's usually the plan B with something like insurance, but this will be a good deep dive into some of the things that we talk to people about and we consider when we are talking about, particularly around ownership structures, and not just the ownership structure per se, because the majority of the time, I guess it's fair to say that that's driven by a taxation consideration, but actually using that same thought process and the same methodology and saying, hey, can we actually change the ownership structure of a particular asset to give us some protection from external creditors. Yeah. Now, I guess that's a really interesting thing to point out. In all of my time doing this and advising people, I've always found that you can structure things a certain way. The one creditor, and this is definitely not what we're saying, and this is definitely not why we do this, but you can't defeat, say, a creditor being a secured creditor, mainly a bank. Yeah. So you'd have personal guarantees and the things like that. But we'll do a deeper dive into that in a sec. But this is definitely not a podcast where we're saying, hey, put your assets in another entity or doing something different because you're trying to defeat creditors. What it is just saying, hey, a little bit of prudent planning. Yeah. And nobody wants to be in this position where their assets are being scrutinised or looked at. But with a little bit of prudent planning, it's just part and parcel, I think, of planning.
Yeah. And look, I think the other thing to note is, firstly, you want to do all of this and plan for this as early as you can in order to minimize, capital gains tax of moving assets from one structure to another structure and, the change of ownership that's associated with that. But also, if you're at the point where, you're receiving a letter from a creditor, or it's getting to the pointy end where you may not have been served yet, but it's looking like it's very close, changing and moving your assets is not going to protect you from that. I think that's a really big key takeaway. This is a strategy that you're going down in order to protect your assets in the infancy of either purchasing and building that asset pool, or doing it with, long foresight for, an event that you hope will never happen. If you're already there, creditors basically have access to everything. Yeah.
Too late. I guess in its simplest form, thinking about this, and probably more relevant to those of us that are self-employed, so thinking about how you separate your personal assets from your business assets. So how can you own particular assets that aren't necessarily in your name? That's probably the first sort of port of call that I think about when we think about this from a really simplistic perspective is what is in your individual name. And really where I think this gets to is if you're under the microscope, if you are being pursued by creditors and you do have personal guarantees signed, then whatever you've got in your name is fair game. Yep. But if you don't have any assets in your name, then obviously they can't get those particular assets.
Yep.
So in my mind, I guess the first layer for me is personal assets versus, well, everything else.
Yeah, exactly right. And separating that, separating your business assets from your personal assets is kind of the key element to it. So how do you do it? It's all good and well to, separate your personal assets from business, but how do you do it, Bills?
I guess the first area, the other consideration or the other vehicle that we tend to look at, there's really a few, but the main one that my mind's going to is having a trust structure.
Yeah.
That's a separate legal entity from the individual itself. There is still some connection through directorships and bits and pieces. There are some ways to plan around that. If there's multiple directors, it's not uncommon to have a trust set up where you have a husband and a wife who is, directors of the trust. And, maybe the wife is running her own business. So the probability that creditors come after her may be a greater consideration. Maybe she gets removed as a director of the trust and the husband continues being the director of the trust. So that's the one that my mind goes to sort of first and foremost in terms of what do you select as the vehicle itself, or what are the things that you should consider in terms of selecting that vehicle.
Yeah. And look, I think the other thing to kind of point out in all of this is different type of trusts, different types of ownership structures will have differing benefits but also costs. So for instance, when you mentioned trusts, so I'm going to compare and contrast owning an asset, whatever that asset is. I'm going to say property because that's kind of the big one, but owning that through a trust versus owning that through individual ownership. So what we're talking about, trust is obviously from an asset protection side of things, can be a beneficial way to shield and separate some of your assets. However, let's say you're negatively gearing a property. When you're owning a property through a trust, the negative gearing benefits or the tax benefits associated with negative gearing will only be apportioned to other profits within the trust. They don't actually get filtered down to the individual's tax. So let's say you've got a property that's negatively geared and that's the only thing that the trust is holding. Well, the tax benefits associated with negative gearing won't actually flow through to the beneficiaries of that trust. And so on one side, you've got, asset protection. On the other side, you've got tax. And that doesn't always happen. I mean, sometimes they work in conjunction with each other, but getting the right advice, and that's going to be probably the key theme throughout this entire podcast, is getting the right advice and getting that early on is going to be the ultimate key to really balance out and take into consideration the broader picture of things as well.
Yeah, and in my experience, it's usually a toss-up between those two things. Yeah. Is asset protection more important, or is the taxation environment more important? And it's always this balancing act saying, okay, and trying to anticipate what potential issue you're trying to solve for. Those two always seem to come up against each other. But going back to what you were saying before, Andrew, getting this structure right at the start is absolutely critical, because if you don't and you decide at a later stage that you're moving assets around or changing ownership structures or ownership entities, it can get very costly. So we talked, you spoke earlier about capital gains tax. So that's definitely one if a gain has been made. The other thing too is, say you're talking about property and you're transferring a property and you're changing the beneficial owner, you're going to trigger stamp duty again. Yeah. Stamp duty is quite an expensive, irrelevant and useless tax.
Just a little bit of personal opinion going in there.
No, well, that's fact. I mean, you can look that up. It's on the internet. It must be true. As an example, it can get quite expensive in order to do that. And thinking about what you're trying to solve for, if you've got a property that's going to cost, on $1 million property, you're talking $55,000 of stamp duty. That's a fairly hefty amount of money to pay just to try and achieve whatever it is that you're trying to achieve with moving an asset from A to B.
Yeah.
So getting it right at the start is absolutely critical.
Yeah. And the other thing to consider as well is what you do with, let's say, an owner-occupied property. So just because it's property doesn't mean it's the same consideration. I mean, an owner-occupied property, you're getting the exemption from the fact that there's no capital gains tax that's involved.
Yep.
In an owner-occupied property when you're living in it. However, if you house that same property, same person living in the property, but own it through a trust, you lose the benefits of being able to claim the fact that you're not paying any capital gains tax on the property. So another consideration for some households is not necessarily in all of your assets, it's a portion of your assets moving it to another partner's name. So let's say, Billy and I are in a relationship, and let's say Billy's a business owner and I'm not. Well, then a consideration would be housing the family home under my name, where there's less risk of potential creditors coming after you because, for instance, you're an employee or you're, not working. So from an asset protection side of things, moving assets to the person that isn't operating and running a business is another consideration as well.
Yeah, and that's a really common strategy that we see deployed with the family home.
Yeah.
It's generally, like what you were saying, the business owner in the relationship, usually a company director.
Yep.
The probability of them, running foul of something, whether it's, an accident on a job site or owing money to creditors or whatever it may be, the probability of them being pursued is far greater than, say, the other member of the household. So looking at, the primary residence, which for the vast majority of the population, that seems to be the key asset that they've got, moving that across. And, there's, thought and consideration goes into, what if that relationship breaks down? I guess family law trumps all of that. So regardless of whose name the assets are in, family law seems to take care of that anyway. So you can transfer an asset to your partner, assuming that you tick certain criteria in terms of the length of your relationship and the status of your relationship, without having to worry about, hey, what happens down the track in the event that we separate. Now, once again, that's a general comment. If you are thinking of doing that, go and get advice on it, because it is something very, very specific, and your circumstances can change the outcome of that. But that's a really common strategy from that perspective.
A good point to note as well that what we're discussing here is asset protection from outside of the family unit. When you are talking about family law, when you're talking about relationship breakdown, that is a completely separate topic. And really, family law advice is, advice from a family lawyer is the only way to really consider protecting your assets in that regard. So we're talking about creditors, we're talking about people that are pursuing you outside of the family unit.
Yep. Andrew, what about a company structure?
Yeah, look, really common one. And it's something that a lot of people just don't turn their minds to or don't necessarily think about. But let's say you're a sole trader and or even just in a partnership and running a business. Because the fact that, or if you then move that business or house that same business in a company, what you now do is create a separate legal entity. So because you've created a separate legal entity, if the company can't pay its debts for whatever reason, creditors generally can't come after the personal assets of the directors unless the company was, trading insolvently or doing something like that. So by simply housing or having your business in a company structure rather than a sole trader structure, it does mean that you're also creating another layer of protection. So not necessarily moving assets, but moving ownership of your, business that you're operating in.
Yeah. And I guess that's, something that we see all the time as well too. Very, very common, and probably the most common structure that we see across the board.
Especially for small businesses. I have seen it a little bit where someone's been running a business on the side. So for, all intents and purposes, this was meant to be a small business that was sitting alongside their, regular income from working as a PAYG employee. Business has taken off, and all of a sudden they've dropped or stopped working as an employee and are solely operating that business. It's, increased in complexity. It's taken on debt. It's doing a lot more, and that's, fantastic for them, but the structure of the business has remained the same. So they've still remained as, a sole trader the whole way through. And really the, structure of the business should be changed depending on what the purpose is at the end of the day. And so really making sure that not only you're setting up the right strategy to begin with, but you're also managing that all the way through is vitally important.
Interesting one, superannuation.
Yeah.
So we talk on the podcast all the time about super as an investment vehicle for the purpose of creating income for retirement. Superannuation as an asset protection vehicle.
Amazing.
Let's chat through it and what does it look like?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, I think the general statement behind this is superannuation as an asset protection vehicle is one of the greatest vehicles that you can utilize from an asset protection side of things. It makes it very difficult for creditors to come after you. And again, I'm prefacing this with the fact that you've done this for the purpose of wealth creation and haven't seen a creditor come in, pumped a whole lot of money into superannuation. That's when it does, or that portion of those funds can be accessed by creditors. But superannuation as an asset protection vehicle is fantastic.
So just to clarify, so super is not a asset that can be ordinarily, that cannot be touched by creditors.
Yep.
The only time that can be touched is if you're using superannuation as a vehicle to shade assets, money from creditors. So you put lump sums of money into superannuation. But if you're going through your ordinary course of your working career and you're adding money to super, fair game, that's protected. Even if you declare bankruptcy, superannuation doesn't form part of the asset pool that gets considered. It's completely separate.
Yeah, exactly right. And I mean, we've spoken at length in this podcast around the tax benefits associated with superannuation. So it can be a very powerful vehicle. And again, making sure that you're doing this in a considered approach is really important, because obviously in order to be able to access those funds, yes, it means that creditors can't access it, but at the same time you can't access it until you meet a condition of release as well. So that's another very big consideration when you're putting a larger amount of money into superannuation as well.
And just on that note as well too, one of the other things that I find really interesting, as an employer, we need to put SGC, super guarantee contribution, into our employees' superannuation funds. A lot of small business owners don't necessarily pay themselves super, which is quite interesting because, I mean, obviously from a cash flow perspective, and I guess there's certain mentalities that, I could use the money better than my superannuation account, or my business is my super. In the event where small business sort of plays out and something goes wrong towards the end of somebody's working career in their own business and they lose everything, like that's not that uncommon. But if throughout the years you were contributing money to super, it's kind of like a bit of a hedge as well too. So maybe not necessarily thinking, if you're a small business owner, about, hey, I don't want to put money into super because I could use it better off somewhere else. Taking a different approach and looking at it from this lens and saying, hey, if something goes wrong, at least I've got this that can't be touched with everything else.
Yeah. And I think it is difficult as business owners to convert business assets into personal assets and business wealth into personal wealth, because of that real attraction that, and look, we can be guilty of it as well. Money that's invested in your business has the opportunity to grow, twofold, threefold, fourfold. Whereas money that's prudently invested is, growing at maybe 5, 6, 7, 10%. And so your attraction is to just continually put money towards your business assets, because that's what's going to yield the potential greatest return, but also return that you have more control over. But when you look at it from an asset protection side of things, if something happens in your business, whether it's caused by you or separate to you and you couldn't have controlled it, you not only lose your ability to generate income. I mean, unless you go and find another job, but you lose your ability to generate income, you lose your biggest asset, and you lose, everything that you've been pouring all your time, effort, and energy towards. Having an element of diversification away from that, both in superannuation or other forms of passive income, means that you're diversifying your risk as well. So from an asset protection side of things, not only are you looking at, pulling money away that can't be accessed by creditors, but also protecting yourself from something outside of your control happening to that business, and being able to still have an income stream coming in, that even if, that business was to ultimately collapse.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty compelling case for business owners to contribute money to super. So I guess that's the message, right? Yeah. Yep. Another vehicle that we've spoken about on the podcast before, but for a different reason, is investment bonds. So looking at investment bonds, and usually we've been discussing those for a particular purpose, because of the just the way that the bonds are made up in terms of the contribution rules, in terms of the 10-year rule, in terms of the tax status rule of it. But there are some advantages from an asset protection perspective as well too. Yeah,
exactly right. And this can in some instances work similarly to superannuation. So you do get some of the tax benefit or some of the asset protection benefits that you also get through superannuation, because again, you're not the owner of the asset. And so being able to utilize superannuation, that especially if you're young, has a very long investment time frame. And so there is, an element of risk that's associated with putting money towards superannuation, in that you can't access it for a long period of time. But looking at an investment bond where your access period might be only 10 years, or potentially even less, but have the same benefits or a lot of the same benefits from an asset protection side of things. And then perhaps you're also looking at, a trust that also houses other assets that has a layer. So what you're doing is starting to just build layers of protection across multiple assets. Mm-hmm. Not only are you building a larger asset pool that's diversified, which, from a wealth creation side of things is fantastic, but you're also building a layer of assets from an asset protection side of things as well.
Yeah, no, well said. I think probably the last one that we've spoken about time and time again, and this isn't necessarily in the same vein as protecting or shielding assets from potential creditors, or if something goes wrong from a business operation perspective or getting sued. This is protecting the wealth of a family in the event that something happens to, somebody in the family, which is personal insurance. Yeah. So looking at that and saying, okay, somebody passes away, rather than needing to sell family assets because debt can't be managed or discharged, the insurance policy kicks in and pays for all of that. So within that that's actually a mechanism to preserve assets.
Yeah, exactly right. Same with, income protection policies or permanent disability, things that are really, out of your control, stop you from being able to work. And all of a sudden it means that, hey, if I don't have an income stream coming in and I don't have enough sick leave left over, or I'm a business owner, I don't have any sick leave, what's the funding mechanism to be able to, continue to make your repayments and preserve the assets that you have? So another massive one, Bills.
Andrew, well said, well summarised. I think we did that one some justice, and a bit of a different approach for us this time in terms of the topic that we were talking about. But hopefully we got some interest in our viewers and our listeners in terms of considering something that maybe they haven't given some consideration to before.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I can't stress enough, when you are sort of embarking on something like this, it is important to receive financial advice, because there are going to be both tax implications as well as asset protection implications as well. So whether it's here at 360 Financial, whether it's another financial planning practice or a lawyer or an accountant, I think it's really important to make sure that you're getting sound advice in regards to this as well. But yeah, Bills, I think that summarises it pretty well.
Fantastic. And to our viewers and our listeners, like and subscribe, and we'll catch you on the next one.
Thanks very much.
Thanks for listening today. If you have any questions on what we've talked about, or would like to have a chat about your money journey, visit us at 360fs.com.au.
Just a reminder to our listeners that the information contained in this podcast is general in nature and it is not intended as personal recommendations for the audience. Please consider whether the information suits your circumstances before acting on it. This information is provided by Billy Amaritis and Andrew Nicolaou of 360 Financial Strategists Proprietary Limited, authorised representatives and credit representatives of AMP Financial Planning.